I stood on the hill overlooking what used to be my family's land, watching 35 luxury homes sitting where my grandfather's oak trees once grew. The morning sun reflected off their perfect windows and manicured lawns. These families had no idea they were living on stolen ground. Margaret Thornfield, the HOA president who orchestrated this theft, had made one critical mistake. She thought she had taken everything from me. But hidden in the woods behind her precious development sat a forgotten earthen dam that my great-grandfather built in 1952. A dam that controlled every drop of water flowing past those beautiful homes. As I reached for the rusted metal wheel that would open the floodgates, I could hear children laughing in the backyards below. Their parents were probably getting ready for work, completely unaware that their dream homes were about to become their worst nightmare. That was the moment I realized that sometimes justice does not come from courts or lawyers. Sometimes it comes from understanding that what goes around truly comes around. I pulled into my driveway after 3 months of medical leave, expecting to see the familiar view of rolling hills and scattered oak trees that had belonged to my family for 4 generations. Instead, I saw construction equipment. Massive bulldozers were moving dirt around what I thought was my back 40 acres. My heart started racing as I parked the truck and walked toward the activity. A chain-link fence now surrounded an area that definitely looked like my property. Signs everywhere read, Willowbrook HOA Development Luxury Creekside Living. I approached the nearest construction worker, a man in a hard hat who was checking blueprints near a trailer. "Excuse me," I called out. "What exactly are you building here?" He looked up with a friendly smile. 35 custom homes, beautiful project, creek access, luxury finishes, the whole 9 yards. "This is my land," I said, pointing toward the survey stakes scattered across the hillside. His smile faded. He walked back to the trailer and returned with a thick folder of documents. "Sir, this land belongs to Willowbrook HOA. We have all the proper permits and ownership papers right here." I stared at the documents he handed me. Official county letterhead, legal descriptions that matched my property exactly, and a deed showing that my 40 acres had been sold for unpaid taxes 6 months ago. "There has to be some mistake," I said, my voice shaking. "I never received any tax notices." The foreman pointed to an address on the paperwork. It was my old apartment address from 15 years ago, before I inherited this property from my father. I rushed home and started making phone calls. The county tax office confirmed the worst news possible. My property had been sold at a tax auction for $38,000 in unpaid taxes. The buyer was Willowbrook HOA, represented by their president, Margaret Thornfield. "But I never got any notices," I told the clerk. "Sir, we sent multiple notices to the address on file. When no response came, the property went to auction as required by law." I had never changed the address with the tax office. For 15 years, tax bills had been going to an apartment I had not lived in since college. When I called my old landlord, he confirmed that tax notices had been piling up in a box of unclaimed mail. I tried calling Margaret Thornfield directly. Her secretary answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Thornfield does not take calls regarding resolved property matters," the woman said coldly. "The sale was completely legal." "I just want to discuss this," I pleaded. "Mrs. Thornfield has nothing to discuss with you. Do not call this number again." The line went dead. That evening, I walked up the hill behind my small remaining cabin and looked down at the construction site. Floodlights illuminated the work area where massive machines were clearing away the oak trees my grandfather had planted in the 1960s. Each tree that fell felt like losing a piece of my family's history. I sat on an old tree stump and tried to process what had happened. In 3 months, I had lost everything. 40 acres of prime land that had been in my family since 1923. Land that was supposed to be passed down to my children someday. The construction would continue for months. Soon, wealthy families would be living in luxury homes built on my family's legacy, and there was apparently nothing I could do about it. The next morning, I hired a lawyer named David Chen who specialized in property disputes. He spent 2 days reviewing the documents and came back with news that was both encouraging and infuriating. The tax sale was technically legal, he explained during our meeting, but there are some questionable elements here. David spread several documents across his desk. First, someone deliberately had your tax notices sent to your old address. Second, Margaret Thornfield has done this exact same thing to 3 other families in this county over the past 10 years. He showed me newspaper clippings and court records. Margaret had a pattern. She would research properties with unclear address records, arrange for tax notices to go to wrong addresses, then swoop in at tax auctions to buy valuable land for pennies on the dollar. "What can we do?" I asked. "Honestly, not much. The courts have upheld these sales before, but I did find something interesting." David pulled out a folder marked Water Rights. "Your great-grandfather was smart when he bought this land in 1923. The deed includes mineral and water rights that are separate from the surface property. Even though you lost the land, you still own the water rights." He pointed to a hand-drawn map from 1952. "This shows a small dam your great-grandfather built to create a livestock pond. Do you know anything about that?" I remembered playing near an old earthen dam as a child, but I had not been back there in 20 years. "I think so. It is way up in the woods." According to these records, that dam controls the primary water source for Willow Creek, the same creek that runs right past the new development. David continued explaining. "Margaret marketed these homes as having year-round creek access. She charged $800,000 per home, specifically advertising the water feature." We drove out to the property that afternoon. I led David through overgrown trails to where I remembered the old dam being. Sure enough, hidden behind decades of brush and small trees, we found it. The structure was about 30 feet wide and 12 feet high, made of packed earth and stones. Water from natural springs filled a small pond behind it, then flowed through a concrete spillway that fed directly into Willow Creek. "This is it," David said, taking photographs. "This dam provides about 70% of the creek's flow during dry seasons." I watched water trickling through the spillway and realized something incredible. Without this dam, Willow Creek would be nothing more than a seasonal trickle. The beautiful waterfront property that Margaret had sold for millions of dollars depended entirely on my family's forgotten dam. "What would happen if this dam were opened?" I asked. David smiled. "Well, you would need to follow proper notification procedures with the county. But this is your property, and you have every right to perform maintenance on your dam." We spent the afternoon researching Margaret's marketing materials for the development. Every brochure promised year-round creek access and permanent waterfront living. The HOA's own environmental impact study admitted that creek flow would be significantly reduced without the upstream dam. That evening, I walked through the development after the construction crews had left. 17 of the 35 home sites had basement recreation rooms that were being built below the original creek bed level. I stood there in the darkness, looking at these massive homes rising from my family's stolen land. But for the first time since discovering the theft, I felt something other than helplessness. I felt possibility. Over the next 2 weeks, I researched everything I could find about dam maintenance, water rights law, and flood patterns. I learned that spring snowmelt typically filled the pond to capacity, creating enormous pressure on the dam structure. I also discovered that Margaret had given written guarantees to all 35 homeowners that their creek would flow year-round. Several families had specifically chosen their lots based on those water promises. Most importantly, I found the original construction plans for the dam. My great-grandfather had installed manual gates that could be opened during high water periods to prevent dangerous pressure buildup. Gates that had been closed for decades. Gates that I had every legal right to open. The first families moved into their dream homes in early spring, just as the snow began melting in the mountains. I watched from the tree line as they hosted housewarming parties on their back decks, children playing beside what they believed was their private creek. The sight of those families enjoying my stolen land filled me with a mixture of rage and sadness. They seemed like good people who had no idea they were living on property taken through manipulation and greed. Then Margaret began her harassment campaign. The first letter arrived on official HOA letterhead. Property Owner Violation Notice, it read. The unsightly dam structure on your remaining property creates an eyesore visible from our community. You are required to remove or significantly upgrade this structure within 60 days. I called David immediately. Can they force me to remove my dam? Absolutely not, but they can make your life difficult through constant legal pressure. Margaret's next move proved his point. She somehow convinced the county to demand that I upgrade the dam to modern safety standards. The estimated cost was over $200,000. This is harassment, I told the county inspector who delivered the notice. Ma'am, we are just following proper safety protocols, he replied. But something in his tone suggested he was not entirely comfortable with the demand. The anonymous threatening notes started appearing in my mailbox a week later, simple messages written on plain paper. Know your place. Stop causing trouble. Some battles are not worth fighting. I installed a security camera and caught Margaret's landscaping crew putting the notes in my mailbox. When I called the police, they said it was too minor to investigate. The harassment escalated when Margaret appeared at my front door one evening with two men in expensive suits. I recognized one as a county commissioner I had seen at local government meetings. I am prepared to offer you $50,000 for your remaining 5 acres, Margaret announced without any greeting. That is more than fair for this worthless land. It is not for sale, I replied. Margaret's face hardened. You need to understand something. I have connections throughout this county. I can make your life very difficult if you continue to be unreasonable. Are you threatening me? I am explaining reality. You lost your land because you were careless and irresponsible. Accept my generous offer and move somewhere more appropriate for someone in your situation. The way she said, your situation, made my blood boil. Like I was some kind of charity case who should be grateful for her attention. Get off my property, I said. Margaret smiled coldly. We will see how long that attitude lasts. The harassment became systematic after that encounter. Code enforcement officers began showing up weekly, writing violations for minor issues that had never been problems before. My grass was too long. My fence needed painting. My mailbox was not regulation height. Each violation came with fines and deadlines that cost me time and money I could not afford. The worst incident happened on a Friday afternoon when my electricity was suddenly shut off. The power company claimed there was a clerical error with my account that would take until Monday to resolve. I spent the weekend in darkness, using candles and eating cold food from cans. When the power was restored Monday morning, I found out that Margaret had somehow convinced someone at the utility company that my account was delinquent. That night, I sat in my small cabin looking across at the fully lit luxury homes that now occupied my family's land. Margaret had made her message clear. She owned this area now, and she would use every connection and every dirty trick to force me out completely. But as I sat there in the darkness, I realized something important. Margaret had made a crucial mistake in her campaign of intimidation. She had shown me exactly how ruthless she was willing to be. She had proven that she would never stop until she had destroyed me completely. And most importantly, she had given me moral justification for what I was planning to do. I walked out to my truck and drove up the old logging road to the forgotten dam. Standing there in the moonlight, I could hear water flowing through the spillway, feeding the creek that made Margaret's development so valuable. For the first time in months, I smiled. I spent the next 3 weeks becoming an expert on everything related to dams, water flow, and seasonal flooding patterns. I checked out engineering books from the library and spent hours online researching case studies of dam operations. What I learned was both fascinating and terrifying. My great-grandfather had built his dam during a particularly dry period in 1952. The structure was designed to capture spring runoff and create a steady water supply for livestock throughout the summer. The manual gates were intended to be opened during heavy runoff periods to prevent dangerous pressure buildup. But those gates had not been opened in over 30 years. I hired a retired county engineer named Frank Morrison to inspect the dam structure. Frank had worked on similar projects throughout his career and understood the technical aspects better than anyone. "Your great-grandfather knew what he was doing," Frank told me as we examined the spillway. "This is solid construction, but you have got decades of sediment buildup behind this dam." He pointed to the pond, which was much larger than it should have been. All that accumulated material would create quite a surge if these gates were opened suddenly. "What kind of surge?" I asked. Frank did some quick calculations on a notepad. During peak snowmelt, you could be looking at 10 times the normal creek flow for several hours, maybe more. I asked him to walk down to the development with me and look at the home construction. Frank examined the basement excavations and shook his head. "These recreation rooms are built right in the original floodplain. Whoever approved these plans did not account for maximum creek capacity. What would happen if the creek suddenly returned to its historical peak flow levels? Those basements would flood within hours. The whole lower section of this development sits below the original high water mark." I spent that evening reviewing Margaret's marketing materials again. Every single brochure promised homeowners that their creek access was permanent and reliable. The HOA's own documents stated that water flow was guaranteed year-round through controlled upstream management. Margaret had essentially promised these families something that depended entirely on my cooperation. Over the next week, I documented everything with photographs and video recordings. I measured current water levels and photographed the basement construction in all 17 affected homes. I also researched the legal requirements for dam maintenance and discovered something crucial. Property owners were not only allowed to perform dam maintenance, they were actually required to prevent dangerous pressure buildup during high water periods. Opening the gates during spring runoff was not just legal, it was a safety obligation. I filed the proper notification paperwork with the county engineering department, stating my intention to perform seasonal maintenance and pressure relief operations on my dam. The forms were approved within 5 days. My friend Sarah, who worked as a paralegal, helped me research the insurance implications. What we discovered was remarkable. The insurance policies for the new homes specifically excluded flood damage in areas below historical high water marks. Margaret had marketed the homes as flood-safe, even though the insurance companies clearly considered them to be in a flood zone. These homeowners have no idea their insurance will not cover water damage, Sarah told me. Margaret sold them policies that are essentially worthless for the exact risk they face. I quietly purchased additional flood insurance for my own small cabin and moved my most valuable possessions to higher ground. I also opened a safety deposit box and stored my father's photo albums and important family documents. The final piece of my planning involved timing. I needed to wait for the perfect conditions, maximum snowmelt, full pond capacity, and a period when the development would be occupied but not hosting any large gatherings. I also needed to be prepared for the legal and personal consequences of what I was about to do. Margaret would certainly try to destroy me through lawsuits and criminal charges. I documented every piece of harassment, every threatening note, and every attempt to force me off my remaining property. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for what was coming. 17 families were going to have their basements flooded. Children's playrooms and finished recreation areas were going to be destroyed. These people had done nothing wrong except trust Margaret's promises. But Margaret had stolen my family's land through deliberate manipulation. She had harassed me for months, trying to force me off my remaining property. She had shown no mercy and no willingness to compromise. The night before I planned to open the dam, I walked through the development one final time. Lights were on in most of the homes. I could see families gathered around dinner tables and children playing in living rooms. Tomorrow, their lives were going to change dramatically. And for the first time since discovering Margaret's theft, I felt completely at peace with what was about to happen. I woke up before dawn on a Saturday morning in early April. 3 days of warm weather had melted the mountain snow faster than usual, and my pond was at maximum capacity. I could hear water flowing over the emergency spillway, creating more pressure on the dam than it had experienced in decades. It was perfect. I made coffee and sat on my front porch, looking down at the sleeping development. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the luxury homes that sat on my family's stolen land. In a few hours, those families would be starting their weekend routines, completely unaware that their lives were about to change. I put on my work boots and grabbed my grandfather's old toolbox from the shed. The metal box was heavy and familiar in my hands, filled with the same tools that had built the original dam 70 years ago. The walk up to the dam took 15 minutes through overgrown trails that my family had used for generations. Each step felt deliberate and ceremonial, like approaching an altar where justice would finally be served. The pond was fuller than I had ever seen it. Water pressure had turned the usual trickle through the spillway into a steady stream. I could feel the power contained behind that earthen wall, decades of accumulated water and sediment waiting to be released. The manual gate controls were exactly where my great-grandfather had installed them in 1952. Two large metal wheels connected to concrete channels that could divert the pond's entire contents directly into Willow Creek. I set my grandfather's toolbox on the ground and opened it slowly. Inside were the same wrenches and tools that had maintained this dam for 3 generations. Tools that Margaret Thornfield had assumed were lost forever along with everything else she had stolen from my family. I began turning the first wheel. The metal protested after 30 years of disuse, but gradually gave way. Water started flowing through the first channel, adding volume to the creek below. I could see the increased flow immediately, the gentle stream becoming noticeably wider and faster. I moved to the second wheel. This one turned easier, and suddenly both channels were open wide. The pond began draining rapidly, sending decades of stored water rushing down the hillside toward Margaret's precious development. I sat on a fallen log and watched the transformation below. Within 30 minutes, Willow Creek had tripled in size. Within an hour, it looked like a completely different waterway. The gentle stream that had meandered peacefully past the luxury homes was now a rushing torrent carrying branches, sediment, and debris from the rapidly emptying pond. I took out my binoculars and focused on the development. The first basement to flood belonged to Margaret's closest ally on the HOA board, a woman named Patricia who had helped orchestrate my harassment campaign. I watched through my binoculars as she discovered water seeping through her basement windows during her morning workout routine. Within minutes, Patricia was outside frantically making phone calls while water continued rising in her finished basement. The second flood hit the house directly across from Patricia's, a young family with 2 small children who had moved in just a month earlier. The father appeared in his backyard looking confused as muddy water began pooling around his basement entrance. By 10 a.m., water was affecting 17 different homes. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles were racing through the development as panicked homeowners tried to save furniture and possessions from their flooding basements. That was when Margaret arrived. She drove up to the dam site in her white luxury SUV, parked crookedly on the trail, and marched toward me with her phone pressed to her ear. Her designer outfit was completely inappropriate for hiking through muddy woods, but rage had apparently overcome her vanity. "What have you done?" she screamed as she approached, knee-deep in the muddy overflow from the rapidly draining pond. I stood up calmly from my position on the log. "I am performing seasonal maintenance on my dam, as required by county safety regulations. You are destroying people's homes. I am managing my water rights according to the notification I filed with the county engineering department 3 weeks ago." Margaret was now standing directly in front of me, her expensive shoes ruined by mud, her perfectly styled hair disheveled from her hike through the woods. "I will sue you for everything you have left," she yelled. "You cannot sue someone for performing legally required maintenance on their own property," I replied, "especially when you marketed those homes with promises you had no legal right to make." Margaret's face went white as she realized what I meant. "You guaranteed those families year-round creek access," I continued, "but you never had any control over the water source. You sold them something that was never yours to sell." Margaret pulled out her phone and started dialing frantically. I could hear her trying to reach county officials, demanding that they force me to close the dam immediately. But it was too late. The pond was nearly empty, and 70 years of accumulated water was rushing through Willow Creek toward the development below. Even if I closed the gates immediately, the damage was already done. I packed up my grandfather's tools and started walking back down the trail. Margaret was still standing in the mud, screaming into her phone, when I disappeared into the trees. By noon, the news crews had arrived. I watched from my front porch as reporters interviewed soaked homeowners and emergency personnel pumped water from flooded basements. The local TV station led their broadcast with footage of the swollen creek and damage to the luxury development. Margaret appeared on camera, perfectly composed despite her earlier mud-covered meltdown at the dam site. She had somehow managed to clean up and change clothes, presenting herself as the calm, professional HOA president dealing with an unexpected crisis. This was clearly a malicious act by a disgruntled individual who lost his property in a legal tax sale, she told the reporter. We are exploring all legal options to hold him accountable for this destruction. But her confident performance was undermined by what happened next. The reporter interviewed several affected homeowners, and their stories revealed cracks in Margaret's version of events. Multiple families mentioned that they had specifically chosen their lots based on guaranteed year-round creek access. Others talked about recreational rooms and finished basements that were now completely destroyed. We were promised this could never happen, one homeowner said. The HOA assured us that the water flow was controlled and permanent. My lawyer David Chen arrived that afternoon with news that changed everything. The insurance companies are refusing to cover the flood damage, he told me. They are saying the homes were built in a known flood zone and that the policies specifically exclude this type of water damage. What does that mean for the homeowners? It means they are looking at tens of thousands of dollars in damage with no insurance coverage. And it means Margaret's promises were worthless. David had been busy researching the legal implications while I was opening the dam. The county engineering department confirmed that you followed all proper procedures. You filed the required notifications, and seasonal dam maintenance is not only legal but mandatory for safety reasons. More importantly, David had discovered something devastating about Margaret's business practices. I found the other families she victimized over the years. They are all willing to testify about her pattern of deliberately misdirecting tax notices to wrong addresses. Within days, the story had grown beyond a simple neighborhood flood. Investigative reporters were looking into Margaret's history of questionable land acquisitions. The county district attorney announced an investigation into potential fraud in the tax sale process. Margaret tried to maintain control by calling an emergency HOA board meeting, but 3 board members resigned immediately. They had apparently been unaware of her past activities and wanted no association with potential criminal charges. The lawsuit started within a week, but not against me. 17 homeowners filed suit against the HOA for misrepresentation and fraud. They claimed Margaret had specifically promised flood-safe waterfront living, while knowing the homes were built in a natural flood plain. 2 of the affected families were lawyers themselves, and they quickly discovered that Margaret had never obtained proper water rights for her development. She had marketed permanent creek access while having no legal control over the water source. She sold them something she never owned, David explained. That is textbook fraud. The media attention grew when other Margaret's victims started coming forward. Over the past decade, she had used the same tax notice manipulation to acquire over 300 acres of valuable property from unsuspecting families. A week after the flood, I received my first call from one of her previous victims. "I saw you on the news," the elderly man said. "Margaret took my family's farm the same way she took your land. I never thought anyone would be able to fight back." "What happened to your farm?" I asked. "She turned it into a shopping center. made millions while I lost everything my grandfather built. Similar calls came every day. Families who had lost property to Margaret's schemes and felt powerless to do anything about it. The flood had apparently inspired them to speak out about their own experiences. Margaret's resignation as HOA president was announced 2 weeks later. The board claimed it was voluntary, but everyone knew she had been forced out when the criminal investigation intensified. The county prosecutor filed charges for tax sale fraud, property manipulation, and misuse of public records. If convicted, Margaret faced significant prison time and complete financial ruin. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from the county assessor's office. "We are prepared to return your original 40 acres through a court-ordered settlement," the clerk told me. "The tax sale has been ruled invalid due to fraudulent address manipulation." Margaret would be forced to relocate the damaged homes at her own expense. After 4 months of legal hell, I was finally getting my family's land back. 6 months later, I stood beside the rebuilt pond watching water flow peacefully through the restored spillway. The creek ran at its natural seasonal levels, sometimes full during spring runoff, sometimes reduced to a trickle during dry summer months. Exactly as nature intended. The luxury development was gone. Margaret had been forced to buy out the damaged homes and relocate them to a different site outside the flood zone. The 17 families affected by the basement flooding had received full settlements for their losses, plus compensation for the emotional trauma of being deceived about their property's safety. Margaret herself was serving an 18-month prison sentence for fraud and conspiracy. The judge had been particularly harsh because of her pattern of victimizing multiple families over many years. "You used your position of trust and knowledge of the system to systematically steal from hardworking families," the judge said during sentencing. "This was not a mistake or oversight, but a calculated criminal enterprise." I attended every day of her trial, sitting in the back row watching as her victims testified about losing their family properties to her schemes. Many of them thanked me afterward for having the courage to fight back when they could not. The 40 acres had been officially returned to me through the court settlement. I spent weeks walking through the restored land, planning how to repair the damage from construction and replant the areas where trees had been destroyed. The story had gained national attention, leading to proposed legislation in our state that would protect property owners from address manipulation tactics. Several other states were considering similar laws based on what had happened in our case. I started a nonprofit organization called the Property Rights Defense Fund to help families fight predatory HOA tactics and questionable tax sales. We had already assisted 12 families in similar situations, providing legal support and media attention to pressure corrupt officials. The work was personally satisfying, but also emotionally exhausting. Each case reminded me of my own experience with Margaret and the months of harassment and intimidation I had endured. But it also reminded me of something important that I had learned from this entire experience. Bullies like Margaret count on their victims feeling powerless and isolated. They use their connections and resources to intimidate people into accepting injustice rather than fighting back. What they do not expect is someone willing to use their own tools against them. As I planted new oak trees where Margaret's construction equipment had once torn up my grandfather's grove, I reflected on how the whole situation had changed my perspective on conflict and justice. Sometimes the legal system works, but sometimes it does not. Sometimes corrupt people use their power to hurt innocent families, and sometimes those families have no recourse through normal channels. But sometimes, if you are patient and strategic and willing to accept the consequences, you can find ways to fight back that bullies never see coming. The creek flowing past my restored property would never again be used to defraud innocent families. The land that had been in my family for 4 generations would be passed down to future generations as originally intended. And Margaret Thornfield would spend the rest of her life explaining to potential employers why she had a criminal record for property fraud. Justice had finally been served, not through courts or lawyers, but through understanding that sometimes the most powerful response to a bully is showing them that their victims are not as powerless as they assumed.